They laughed when Caleb Rowan wheeled his $500 flood barrier into the Kingsley Aeronautics boardroom. CEO Victoria Kingsley called it a collapsible pile of scrap, and the engineering panel tossed his blueprints onto the floor in front of him. 6 hours later, the Bellamy River crested its banks, water surged across the airstrip, and a wall of current bore down on a $2 billion aircraft factory. When the company's $12 million flood system went dark, Victoria had exactly one option left: find the man they had just humiliated, before the entire aviation empire went under. If you love a reversal that leaves the arrogant speechless, subscribe now and stay until the very last line. The Bellamy River had never been a gentle neighbor to the Kingsley Aeronautics complex. Moving through the industrial flatlands south of the city, with the quiet authority of something that had existed long before the concrete was poured, and would remain long after the last bolt was tightened, and on the nights when it ran high and brown with storm water carried down from the mountains. The sound of it filtered through the corrugated walls of the maintenance tunnels, like a reminder no engineer had asked for. Caleb Rowan had worked the overnight infrastructure shift at Kingsley for 4 years, walking the same inspection rounds while the rest of the facility slept, checking gauges and hatch seals and drainage channels that no one in the executive wing had examined directly since the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He was 39 years old, lean from years of physical work rather than any deliberate effort, and he had the kind of quiet that people in expensive offices tend to mistake for emptiness. Before Kingsley, he had spent 6 years working field operations for a regional flood control contractor, running bypass calculations, pressure testing culvert joints, mapping storm surge paths across industrial sites, and that knowledge had settled into him the way practical knowledge always does, becoming instinct rather than information. He was, by every metric the company used to sort people into categories, an infrastructure technician on the overnight roster, and that title meant the findings in his inspection reports were read, if they were read at all, with the low urgency reserved for things that have not yet broken. On the third Tuesday of that October, Caleb ran his flashlight along the lower frame of the transport tunnel, the connecting passage between the cargo loading dock and the sublevel engineering floor, and felt the door seal give under his thumb the way old rubber gives, firm at the surface, crumbling just beneath it. The eastern barrier door rail had taken a forklift strike sometime in the previous year, bending just enough that the flood plate would never sit flush against the ground, and the secondary pump station 60 meters north had been dropping its telemetry signal for several nights in a row, not long enough to trigger a formal alert, but long enough for Caleb to log it 3 separate times without receiving a single substantive response from the maintenance coordinator. The County Water Authority's public river gauge showed the Bellamy running at 112% of its seasonal average, a figure that sounded modest until he cross-referenced it against the elevation of the tunnel entrance, which sat 14 inches below the flood stage threshold recorded during the last major storm cycle. The runway expansion completed 6 months earlier to accommodate the KX-9 Ether's test schedule had also altered the surface drainage geometry in a way that no one appeared to have modeled. Instead of sheeting westward toward the retention basin as designed, heavy rainfall now channeled directly toward the tunnel approach, concentrating load at the exact point where the barrier system was weakest. Caleb filed his inspection report that night through the standard portal, attaching photographs of the degraded seal, a diagram of the elevation discrepancy, and a printout of the river gauge trends going back 30 days. And by morning the system had replied with an automated acknowledgement and a projected response window of 5 to 7 business days. He drove home through streets still dark at 5 in the morning, past the elementary school where Lena would wake in a few hours, and make her own breakfast the way she had learned since her mother passed. And when he came through the door, she was already at the kitchen table with her homework, 14 years old and far too perceptive for her own comfort. She watched him set down a tote bag of mismatched aluminum brackets, sections of salvaged aircraft floor rail, and coils of industrial-grade rubber gasket material, and she asked without looking up whether he was building another prototype nobody upstairs would bother to look at. He told her water didn't care what uniform the person giving the warning was wearing, and she said she knew that, and that was exactly why she was asking. The idea behind the prototype was not complicated and did not need to be. The transport tunnel was the single point at which a controlled amount of water could reach an uncontrolled number of critical systems, and a passive barrier at its entrance, one that required no electricity, no software commands, and no maintenance window, would use the water pressure itself to tighten its own seal as the load increased. He had priced the materials that afternoon during his lunch break, and the total came to $487.63. The radio on the kitchen counter was cycling through the overnight weather broadcast when the forecaster mentioned, in the careful language of official probability, that a broad moisture band was tracking northeast through the Bellamy watershed and was expected to arrive within 72 hours. Grant Whitmore occupied the kind of office that announced its own importance before the visitor had taken a second step inside it. The framed engineering certifications, the scale model of the facility's flood control infrastructure, the photographs of handshakes with state officials, all arranged with the precision of a man who understood that credibility in large organizations was often more about the appearance of competence than the substance of it. When Caleb arrived without an appointment and asked for 20 minutes, Grant gave him 12 and spent the first 4 checking messages on his phone while Caleb stood. Caleb placed the inspection report on the desk, pointed to the photographs of the degraded seal and the bent door rail, and explained in straightforward terms that the transport tunnel represented the single most critical vulnerability in the facility's water defense. It sat below flood stage elevation and connected directly to the electrical substation, the server room, the avionics battery laboratory, and the KX-9 storage bay, which meant a breach at that point would compromise every system the facility needed to function simultaneously. Grant listened with the expression of a man being told the sky was a color he had already patented, then swiveled his monitor around to show Caleb the facility dashboard. A grid of green status indicators covering every sensor node in the flood management system, and explained that the $12 million infrastructure commissioned under his oversight had been independently rated to withstand a 500-year flood event. Caleb asked a single question: whether the sensors confirmed the doors had achieved a full physical seal, or only that the drive motors had received and completed a close command. Grant stared at him for a moment before explaining, with the particular patience reserved for correcting subordinates who have wandered outside their lane, that there was a meaningful difference between an infrastructure specialist with decades of experience and a night shift maintenance technician, and that perhaps Caleb should allow the specialists to manage the systems the specialists had built and paid for. Caleb noted, without raising his voice, that the rail damage on the eastern barrier plate meant the door could not physically achieve a complete seal regardless of what signal the motor had sent, because the motor logged completion of its own cycle rather than confirmation of a gap closed, and that the sensor would report the door as locked, because that was exactly what it had been programmed to report. Grant told him the prototype sitting in the tote bag was not an appropriate submission for a facility operating at Kingsley's level, and Caleb said the barrier had been designed specifically for the tunnel entrance, would cost under $500 in materials, required no power, no software, and no ongoing maintenance, and would use water pressure itself to tighten the seal as the load increased. The deeper the water, the stronger the hold. Grant asked with the tone that powerful men deploy to remind rooms where the authority sits, whether Caleb was seriously proposing that a $2 billion aerospace corporation protect itself with something assembled at a kitchen table. Mara Ellison, whose office sat 2 doors down the corridor, and who had requested a copy of the inspection report that same morning through a back channel, had already run the numbers independently and found every figure accurate, and she drafted a 1-page summary and carried it to the scheduling office for the pre-launch safety review, asking for 15 minutes on the agenda and framing it as a final checklist item before the KX-9 event. The meeting slot was confirmed for the following afternoon. What Mara did not know was that Grant spent that same evening accessing the incident tracking system and reclassifying Caleb's report from critical, immediate review required to monitoring, next cycle assessment, a change that required his access credentials and took less than 90 seconds to execute, quietly removing the report from the stack that would reach Victoria's attention before the launch event. The conference room on the upper floor of the Kingsley complex had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, and the KX-9 Ether model sat at the center of the table like a sculptural centerpiece that the room had been designed around. The executives who filled the chairs wore suits that cost more than Caleb's monthly take-home pay, and they turned toward him when he entered in the same way that people at a formal dinner turn toward someone who has arrived at the wrong venue, with a brief, calibrated attention that communicates, without words, that the situation has already been assessed and the outcome is not in question. Grant was already standing at the head of the table beside a projected slide deck, and he gave Caleb the kind of small smile that contains its own verdict before the proceeding has technically begun. Victoria Kingsley sat at the far end, composed, her attention already partially elsewhere, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about the level of seriousness with which the invitation had actually been issued. He spoke for 4 minutes without notes, explaining the tunnel's elevation relative to projected flood stage, the sensor gap between motor completion and physical seal confirmation, the secondary pump station's telemetry drops, and the compounding effect of the runway expansion on surface drainage. 4 specific, measurable problems that individually were manageable and collectively were not. He then placed the passive barrier prototype on the table, and the room looked at it the way rooms look at things that do not belong to the register they have been operating in. Recycled aluminum sheeting, salvaged floor rail sections, industrial gasket rubber, and mechanical locking pins assembled by a man working outside his shift hours with materials he had sourced from a surplus catalog. Grant interrupted before Caleb had finished explaining the water pressure locking mechanism, describing the proposal as a science project submitted by someone whose professional responsibility was checking drain covers in the middle of the night, and he invited the room to consider whether it was appropriate for a company of Kingsley's stature to obtain an infrastructure guidance from an overtime maintenance worker on the strength of a $500 prototype and a set of concerns that the company's own $12 million system had already assessed as within normal parameters. Russell Dane leaned back and asked, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, why a corporation valued at $2 billion should pause a major product launch because a technician had spent an amount that would not cover a dinner at the company's preferred catering venue. Victoria reached across and picked up one of the locking pins, turned it in her hand, examined the edge of the recycled aluminum panel with the neutral attention of someone who has already made a decision and is completing the formality of the process, and then set it back down. She said Kingsley Aeronautics manufactured aircraft, not improvised levees, and the room found this sufficient. Grant slid the blueprint off the table's edge with 2 fingers, and it landed face down on the floor between Caleb's feet with a flat sound that no one in the room acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required them to recognize what it meant. The suspension order, citing unauthorized escalation of a maintenance concern outside the chain of reporting, was signed before Caleb had reached the elevator. Mara stood in the hallway and watched him pass without speaking, then went back to the conference room, waited for the catering staff to begin clearing the coffee service, and carried the prototype and its components to a storage cabinet in the 3rd-floor maintenance closet, logging it under a miscellaneous equipment label that no one who was looking for it would find and no one who was not looking would notice. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the first lightning of the incoming system divided the sky above the Bellamy, and the water below it had already begun to change color. The KX-9 Ether launch reception occupied the full width of the main assembly hangar, and the caterers had dressed the prefabricate walls in white fabric that made the space feel like something between an air show and a state dinner, and investors, defense procurement officials, and aviation journalists moved through the crowd with champagne glasses, while the prototype hung above them on its display rigging in the overhead rig lights, clean and composed in a way that the weather outside was not. Victoria Kingsley took the stage at the East End and began to speak about the future of American aerospace manufacturing, with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed this particular speech in her own mind for a decade, covering KX-9's fuel efficiency data, its projected market position, and the contract pipeline that made it the cornerstone of the company's next 5 years. The rain was audible on the hangar roof, a continuous low percussion that the sound engineers had increased the ambient music to compensate for, and the weather feed on Caleb's phone, parked on his truck's dashboard in the lot of the County Water Authority observation point, showed the Bellamy River at 131% of flood stage and climbing at a rate that had not been in the afternoon forecast. He had driven there instead of going home directly, and he sat in the dark, watching the river move through the early evening with the sluggish, swollen indifference of something that had stopped taking requests, while the upstream discharge from 18 hours of mountain rain continued to push south toward the flat section of the watershed where the complex sat. Mara had left the launch event early, citing a headache to the colleague beside her, and had walked the lower maintenance corridor with a flashlight she had not yet needed to use because the overhead lights were still working. At the junction between the cargo bay and the tunnel entrance, she found what she was looking for. A thin line of water tracing the grout joint in the concrete floor outward from the barrier door's lower edge, moving slowly, quietly, and with great certainty. She called Grant's mobile number, and he answered on the 3rd ring with the event noise behind him, and she described what she was seeing. He told her the sensor panel was showing full containment, that the automated systems had been designed precisely for this scenario, and that creating a disturbance at the reception would reflect poorly on the entire infrastructure team and, by extension, on the people who worked within it. She asked him directly whether the eastern barrier door was physically sealed, and he said the system had confirmed it. The automated control system received a flood threshold trigger at 11:47 that evening and issued close commands to all 14 barrier doors in the lower complex and 13 sent seal confirmation within seconds, and the 14th, the eastern barrier in the transport tunnel, completed its motorcycle and sent the same confirmation, because the sensor measured motor completion rather than contact between the plate and the floor, and the bent rail meant the panel stopped 8 inches above the concrete. In a substation alcove 60 meters north of that gap, the first thin current of water found the base of the secondary pump housing and began, with patient indifference, its work. Cowrick. The short circuit that killed the secondary pump station was not dramatic. A muffled pop, a smell of ozone that the ventilation system dispersed before any of the 3 technicians in the lower corridor had time to identify it, and then a status change on a monitoring panel that no one was watching because the panel operator had been reassigned to the reception as additional event support staff. The backup generator engaged within 11 seconds, as it had been designed to do, and routed power to the production floor, the avionics laboratory, and the primary lighting grid, but not to all 14 flood barrier drive motors, because the load-shedding protocol that Grant had approved during the system's commissioning had deprioritized the barrier drives in order to protect the laboratory instruments, and 6 of the automated doors that had been holding position lost their motor power and began to drift as the water pressure behind them built. The transport tunnel became a conduit, not a wall of water the way disaster is usually imagined, but a floor of it, spreading outward from the entrance across the sublevel with the quiet, purposeful deliberateness of water that has finally located what it was seeking. Shipping containers on low pallets shifted as their base buoyancy changed, and a motorized ground support vehicle rolled 2 feet without anyone touching it and blocked the primary maintenance access stairwell, and the 3 technicians in the corridor had begun moving toward the junction point when Grant's voice came through the intercom asking for a status update, and they told him water was inside, and he told them to activate the primary pump array. The pump array intake was sitting 6 inches below the river's current surface elevation, which meant it was pushing water inward rather than drawing it out. Mara found the physical maintenance log in the tunnel supervisor's cabinet, a clipboard that had not been digitized and had not been part of the records Grant had access to through the infrastructure database. And she read through it with her flashlight while water moved around her boots. The log recorded that the eastern barrier door rail had been struck by a forklift on the 14th of July, that the repair had been estimated at $11,000 and 2 days of downtime, and that the work order had been submitted and then quietly canceled 9 days later, with the cancellation signature belonging to Grant Whitmore and the reason listed in a junior coordinator's handwriting as pre-event freeze on non-critical maintenance. She photographed every page and forwarded them to her own secure account before the water reached the cabinet shelf. Victoria was standing at the edge of the loading bay when the water crossed the threshold of the main floor, and she saw it with her own eyes. Not a sensor reading, not a status color, not a confirmation on a dashboard, but actual river water, dark and carrying the faint mineral smell of the Bellamy, spreading across polished concrete beneath the overhead lights. She turned to Grant, who was standing behind her with a radio in his hand, and asked him to explain the discrepancy between what the system had confirmed and what was currently moving across the floor at their feet, and he began a sentence about anomalous conditions and sensor calibration thresholds that she did not allow him to finish. She asked Mara, who was standing 6 feet away with her phone already in her hand, whether she had a way to reach Caleb Rowan. Mara had his number ready. Caleb answered on the second ring and did not ask how bad it was or what had gone wrong, because he already understood both, and instead he asked Mara for the current water reading at the tunnel junction, the estimated flow rate based on the known dimension of the barrier gap, and the last confirmed power status of the central electrical substation. She gave him the figures she had. He performed the arithmetic without writing it down and told her they had under 90 minutes before the water reached the server room floor, that the automated system in its current state could not stop it, and that the prototype in the maintenance closet, if it was still there, was the only remaining option with any realistic chance of protecting the substation. She told him it was there. He said he was 15 minutes away. Victoria gathered what remained of her leadership team in the loading bay vestibule and put the call on the facility's open speaker, and she told the room that Caleb Rowan was returning to the facility, that he would have full operational authority over all activity in the lower complex, and that any instruction he issued was to be followed without revision or delay. There was a silence in the room of the kind that follows when a hierarchy collapses faster than anyone expected. Not the silence of agreement, but the silence of people recalculating very quickly. Grant said that recalling a suspended employee, particularly one suspended for a disciplinary matter, would set a precedent the board would find difficult to accept and would compromise the integrity of the oversight process. Victoria looked at him with an expression that contained no softness and told him that he had suspended Caleb for reporting a problem that was now visibly spreading across the floor between them, and that as a condition of his continued presence in the building, she was asking him to say nothing further. She then told Caleb, through the open line, that she was sorry. She did not qualify it or contextualize it or frame it as a conditional apology, just the two words, stated plainly, in front of everyone in the room. Caleb acknowledged it and asked her to have a forklift staged at the maintenance closet entrance, clear the lower corridor of all non-essential personnel, and confirm that the Western Retention Basin's manual intake override was accessible. He arrived at the security gate in his truck, and the guard had been called ahead and waved him through, and the lower corridor he walked down to reach the maintenance closet was lined on both sides with engineers, technicians, and 2 members of the event catering staff who had not managed to leave before the lockdown, and none of them spoke as he passed, because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already made obvious. Some of them were the same people who had been in the conference room the day before. The prototype was in the cabinet where Mara had left it, and when Caleb laid the components out on the corridor floor for a condition check, he found the missing piece immediately. The primary locking bar that held the lateral tension across the frame at full water load had been separated from the assembly during transport and was not present, and without it the barrier could deflect the initial flow but would not hold under sustained surge pressure. He stood with the gap in the frame in front of him and ran through the available inventory in the adjacent maintenance room. And when he found the titanium cargo floor anchor pins used in the aircraft loading bay, 12-centimeter bolts rated for dynamic tensile loads in flight operations, he understood they could substitute if he rebuilt the upper crossframe geometry to redistribute the load path. It was not the design he had built at his kitchen table. It was the design the next 80 minutes required. He told the forklift operator to move the assembly to the tunnel junction and asked the 2 engineers who had been watching from the hallway to bring every cargo strap they could locate in the supply room adjacent. The forklift began moving through water that had already reached knee height in the tunnel approach and continued to rise. Caleb divided the available workers into 5 groups without ceremony, because explanations required time, and the water did not observe that particular courtesy. The first group he put to work clearing the anchor channel at the base of the tunnel entrance. Broken seal fragments, sediment, a section of aluminum conduit that had floated in from the loading bay, because a barrier frame performs only as well as the surface it rests against, and a single gap in the channel contact would render the gasket compression worthless. The second group handled the rubber gasket strips, cutting them to length against the concrete lip and pressing them into the channel groove by hand when clamps were not immediately available, using the heel of a boot where fingers could not apply enough force. The third group staged the aluminum panels in sequence along the wall, because the installation order mattered and disorder in the first 2 minutes would cost the last 2 that were not available to lose. The fourth group began moving electrical equipment from the substation floor to staging pallets that the generator crew had rolled in from the north access point because even if the barrier held, the water already inside the lower level needed to be kept away from live panels through the duration of the crest. The fifth group, 2 people with a truck winch and 300 meters of steel-braided cable, went to the retention basin access point on the western perimeter to clear the channel and prepare the manual override for the basin intake gate. The engineers from the upper floor who had sat in the conference room in their expensive suits were now standing in knee-deep water in their dress shoes following instructions from a man in a work shirt, and none of them said a word about it, because the water was real in a way that hierarchy is not. Grant stood at the edge of the work zone where the water line met the dry corridor floor and made 3 predictions in the space of 20 minutes. That the barrier frame would buckle under the asymmetric load, that the improvised titanium pins would not seat correctly in the modified cross-frame geometry, and that the gasket material would fail to form a continuous seal against a concrete surface that had not been machined to specification. Each prediction was stated with the precise authority of a man who needed to be right more than he needed anyone in the building to survive the night. Victoria had stopped observing from a distance and was carrying tool bags from the supply staging area to the installation point alongside Mara, and when one of the anchor channel brackets came loose during alignment and the framework lurched sideways under the water pressure, she braced the opposite face without being asked, because it needed to be braced, and she was the closest person to it. When the last panel was seated, and the titanium pins drove home through the rebuilt crossframe, the barrier face shuddered against the incoming load with a sound that traveled through the water and the concrete and the bodies of everyone standing in both, a single deep resonant note that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. The aluminum facing bowed at the center, 2 centimeters of deflection under the initial surge pressure, and Grant exhaled loudly from the corridor behind, beginning a sentence that contained the word failure. The bow stabilized. The gasket rubber, compressed against the channel floor by the water pressure itself, darkened along its lower edge as the continuous seal completed its contact. The flow rate at the junction dropped visibly, and Mara had a measuring stick against the tunnel wall, and after 90 seconds, she reported the rate of rise had decreased by approximately 60%. And then the drain cover on the floor of the KX-9 hangar trembled in its seat and rose half an inch, and a column of dark water pushed up through the gap and spread across the polished floor in a slow, widening ring that had nothing to do with the tunnel barrier and everything to do with something else entirely. Grant's response was immediate and categorical. The barrier was compromised, the hangar was breached, and the correct procedure was the closure of the hangar's emergency blast doors, which would seal the KX-9 and its support equipment inside a watertight enclosure and prevent further ingress. What the blast door protocol would also accomplish, as Caleb understood in the half-second it took Grant to finish the sentence, was trap every gallon of water currently entering through the floor drain inside a sealed room with no outlet, transforming the hangar into a pressurized basin, and the KX-9 ether, 9 years of engineering work, the centerpiece of the company's defense contract pipeline, the asset the entire launch event had been celebrating, would be submerged not by the river but by the people attempting to protect it. Caleb stepped in front of the control panel. He asked for the facility's original construction drawings, not the digital version in the current infrastructure database, but the physical archive set filed at the time of the original building permit, and a facilities coordinator ran for them and returned with a rolled set of blueprints in a deteriorating cardboard tube, and Caleb spread them against the hangar wall under a flashlight while the water continued to rise around his ankles. He found what he needed on sheet 17, a secondary drainage conduit drawn in dotted line notation indicating a temporary bypass running beneath the runway extension and connecting the hangar's subsurface drainage field to the western retention basin, annotated with a field note reading "Permanent cap to be installed at completion of runway extension. Confirm with project engineer," and in the lower right corner of the sheet, a signature block bearing the initials GW. The runway extension had been completed 7 months ago, and the permanent cap had not been installed, and the temporary bypass had been buried under the new runway surface and removed from the digital as-built records without notation, leaving the hangar's drainage field connected to a conduit that now had no outlet because its terminus at the retention basin had been sealed off during the same construction project. Every gallon of rainwater sheeting off the new runway surface for the preceding 7 months had been accumulating slowly in the subsurface drainage field, and now, with the river elevated and the field completely saturated, it was finding the only path available: upward through the hangar floor drains. Caleb described this to Victoria in 11 words. "The hangar is draining the wrong direction because of a sealed conduit." She asked what was needed, and he said 2 of the aircraft tow vehicles needed to break the temporary concrete barrier at the retention basin inlet on the west perimeter, reopening the conduit outlet, and it needed to happen before the basin's passive overflow protection triggered and sent the water back east. Grant told Victoria that breaking the landscaped concrete barrier along the western approach would cause structural damage to a decorative retaining feature that had cost $230,000 and would expose incomplete construction documentation to regulatory review at the worst possible time. Victoria looked at him for 1 full second, then told the tow vehicle operators, on open radio, to take the barrier apart. The 2 vehicles hit the concrete form from opposite angles, and the temporary cap gave way on the 3rd impact, and the backed-up drainage reversed through the newly opened conduit with an audible rush that the crew on the western perimeter felt through the soles of their boots. The water level on the hangar floor stopped rising within 4 minutes and began to recede. The barrier at the tunnel junction continued to hold. But the upstream discharge was still moving south, and the models Caleb had been updating on his phone showed the true flood crest, substantially larger than anything that had arrived so far, reaching the complex in approximately 18 minutes. The titanium pin assembly at the upper right corner of the barrier frame had begun to work itself loose under sustained vibration, a thread of water tracing the joint in a line that grew measurably thicker every 40 seconds, and Caleb looked at it and looked at his watch and told the group what they had. He called the non-essential personnel evacuation complete and told everyone who was not part of the barrier crew to move to the 2nd floor and stay there. The flood crest did not arrive like the wall of water that disaster tends to look like in dramatized accounts. It came as an acceleration, a measurable increase in the rate that water pushed against the barrier face, something that Caleb registered through the metal decking beneath his boots before he could see it on Mara's measuring stick. The $12 million automated flood system had at this point ceased to function as a unified system in any meaningful way. 6 barrier drives without power, 3 of the remaining doors holding against loads their commissioning specs had not anticipated, the electronic monitoring network reporting sensor data from components that no longer existed in their reported configuration, the secondary pump station dark. Only the passive barrier at the tunnel junction continued to perform exactly as it had been designed to perform, because its operation did not depend on electricity, software, a command signal, or any system the flood could disable or deceive. The aluminum facing deflected under the crest load with a deeper bow than before, 4 centimeters at the maximum point, and the pin at the upper right corner moved another millimeter toward the edge of its seat, and Grant called down from the stairwell landing above that the frame was going to separate. Caleb ran the last cargo strap through the backup anchor point he had driven into the concrete wall 2 hours earlier and pulled the tension across the upper rail, distributing the bending force into the wall structure rather than the joint, and the pin stopped moving. The crest held for 22 minutes, and during those 22 minutes the server room remained dry. The central electrical substation continued without interruption to supply power not only to the facility's operations but to the emergency lighting in the surrounding district and the communications relay for the County Emergency Management Office, and the KX-9 ether and every piece of fabrication tooling on the production floor remained above the waterline. A county emergency helicopter repositioning between rescue operations swept its searchlight across the industrial district, and the camera feed that reached the Emergency Operations Center showed the Kingsley complex sitting in the center of a dark, reflective plain, the only structure in the affected zone with its lights fully on, surrounded on 3 sides by water, its buildings intact. Grant made his final attempt at revisionism from the stairwell landing, telling the 2 engineers beside him that the passive barrier had been included in the infrastructure team's contingency planning as a secondary measure, and that its deployment represented the system functioning as intended. Mara had her phone in her hand. She played 40 seconds of audio recorded in the conference room the previous afternoon. Grant's voice, unhurried and certain, calling the prototype a garage project that would humiliate the company in front of its own engineers. The 2 engineers beside him did not say anything. Grant did not say anything either. Victoria, standing in water that had just begun to pull back from the barrier's base, looked toward the stairwell and said, without raising her voice, that she would need the full board convened by 9 in the morning. The same conference room, the same table, with the KX-9 model at its center, though the model now sat at a slight angle because someone had bumped it during the evacuation and no one had thought to straighten it. The windows showed the river, lower now but still carrying the last of the storm's discharge in broad, slow movements, and the morning light came in gray and flat across the wet airstrip. Caleb arrived last, in the same clothes he had worn through the night. River sediment dried on his boots in a pattern that made each step faintly audible on the polished floor. No one in the room laughed, and no one looked at him with the expression that rooms produce when they are performing patience towards someone they have already dismissed because that particular performance had become impossible sometime around midnight. Mara presented the documentation in sequence, without a single word of editorial framing, which was the most precise possible method of allowing the facts to complete their own argument. She showed the board the 3 filed inspection reports and their automated responses, the maintenance log with the canceled repair order and Grant's cancellation signature, the infrastructure risk database entry with the reclassification from critical to monitoring, time-stamped with his credentials, the construction drawings with the unsigned conduit notation and the initials in the signature block, the audio recording from the conference room, the photographs of the degraded seal and the bent door rail, and the post-event sensor logs showing the eastern barrier door registering as sealed at the exact moment that a 6-inch gap had been allowing water to pass freely beneath it. Grant built a defense around the word unprecedented. The storm had exceeded design parameters. The sensor discrepancy was a calibration issue under review. The maintenance deferral was a judgment call made in good faith under significant schedule pressure. And Caleb did not argue with any of it in emotional terms, because emotion was not the relevant currency. He placed a printed timeline on the table that matched Grant's own email timestamps against the inspection reports, the maintenance cancellation, and the risk reclassification, and let the sequence carry the weight. Victoria spoke without prepared notes. She told the board that she had been shown evidence, in person and in writing, by an employee with no title and no institutional standing in the organization, and that she had allowed the cost of the prototype and the rank of the person presenting it to substitute for her own judgment about the quality of the evidence itself, and that this had been a failure of leadership, and she said the word failure without softening it, in front of the assembled board, the legal team, the 3 journalists who had been admitted to the session as a condition of the company's public statement, and Caleb. Grant was removed from his position effective that morning, with the complete documentation forwarded to the facility's independent safety auditor and to the State Construction Licensing Authority. Russell Dane recovered his composure and proposed that the company purchase Caleb's design outright for a figure he described as appropriate to the circumstances. Caleb looked at the contract that Dane's assistant slid across the table, then at Dane, and said that money was not the first item on the list. The list had 6 items. Kingsley Aeronautics would receive a use license for the barrier design but would not own it. The patent application, which Caleb had filed through a legal aid clinic 6 weeks earlier using money set aside from overtime shifts, belonged to him and would remain so. Every facility operated by the company would undergo an independent structural safety audit within 180 days, conducted by a third party with no existing relationship with the organization. Workers at any level of the company would have a direct reporting channel for safety concerns that bypassed their immediate supervisory chain, with legal protection from retaliation as a standing condition of continued company operations. A technical improvement fund seeded with $1 million would be established to evaluate and implement design proposals submitted by frontline workers. Mara Ellison would lead the newly created Office of Infrastructure Resilience, with a budget, a staff, and a seat at the operational planning table that no vice president could override unilaterally. And Caleb Rowan would retain full rights to license the passive barrier system to municipalities, airports, industrial facilities, and emergency management agencies independent of any arrangement with Kingsley Aeronautics or its subsidiaries. Victoria accepted all 6 conditions without negotiation, which surprised the legal team and surprised no one who had been in the flood tunnel the previous night. She offered Caleb the position of Director of Infrastructure Resilience with a title, a compensation structure, and an office on the executive floor. And he accepted the first 2 and asked that his office be placed adjacent to the maintenance workshop on the ground level, because that was where the relevant information originated and where he had always done his clearest thinking. In the months that followed, the passive barrier system was installed at 3 regional airports, a coastal power generation facility, and 11 manufacturing plants across 4 states, and the small firm Caleb registered 4 people, capitalized in part by an account he had quietly been building for Lena's education. Manufactured the licensed units under a serial number system that began with the date the prototype had been completed at the kitchen table. Mara rebuilt the safety reporting infrastructure from the sensor level upward, and the first class of technical reviewers she trained included 2 engineers who had stood in the conference room 2 days before the flood, and said nothing while a blueprint was pushed off a table. At the formal commissioning ceremony for the facility's rebuilt flood defense system, Victoria introduced Caleb to the assembled press, government officials, and Kingsley employees as the person who had protected the company at the moment when its own leadership had refused to listen, and afterward someone from the installation crew affixed a small placard to the original prototype, which had been cleaned and mounted near the tunnel entrance. The placard read, "Cost of materials, $487.63. Cost of not listening, $2 billion. Lena stood beside him for the photograph that followed, and when the cameras had finished, she asked him quietly whether the people who had laughed at the design still called it scrap. He looked at the barrier, the original, standing exactly where it had held through the worst of the water, and said, "No, now they call it by the name of the man who built it."